Hello, Father Dominic. Really good to have you with us. I've been looking forward to this conversation. So I know you're going to share with us a bit today about the organisation that you work with, Grief to Grace. Maybe to start off with, could you just explain what this organisation is for people who haven't ever heard about it?
Thank you, Isabel. It's great to be with you. Yeah, Grief to Grace. Grief to Grace is a programme of spiritual and psychological healing for people who have suffered sexual abuse in childhood, sustained, prolonged physical, emotional, spiritual abuse, or have had some kind of violation in adulthood, have been raped, for example. I say a spiritual and psychological program, that's very important. So it's not faith healing, we're not just praying, nor are we seeking to sort of, as it were, diagnose and simply use the tools of psychology. It's a very skillful, beautiful integration of both those things, so that the psychology, the human science of psychology, and in particular understanding of trauma, is used to try and clear the space for the action of the Holy Spirit, who is there in our retreat program because it's all grounded in scriptures. So to put that in concrete terms, for example, what sort of things psychologically are you dealing with? If you're dealing with sexual abuse trauma, you're dealing with a resistance to the idea of looking at that pain, because most people have to get on with their lives and keep this secret and put on their happy face, even though inside there's a part of them that's struggling with that. So a theme like resistance, which might take 6 months on a psychiatrist's couch, we look at in the context of the scriptures. So the healing of the man at the pool of Bethesda. A man has been ill for 38 years. And the first question Jesus asked him is, do you want to get well? The Americans would say that's a no-brainer. But actually, he responds by saying, well, I'd love to, but every time I try to get there, something happens and someone else gets there before me. So that's a theme in recovering from some of these really serious wounds in my life, that they actually define my identity. And there's a part of me that wants to be better, of course, but there's a part of me that doesn't know how to do that, and it's become my identity. A bit like if you've walked around with a crutch for 6 weeks, it's going to feel very odd if you haven't got it, and quite frightening. So there's a theme of resistance. Anger would be a huge thing for people who've had any kind of trauma. So we deal with that anger in the context of Jesus cleansing the temple, when Jesus, who is usually very gentle and meek and tender, gets really angry because there's a violation to the sacred temple going on here. So we use that to say, well, the temple of your body was violated. So of course Jesus is angry. It's okay for you to be angry. It's a righteous anger. So that's an example of the integration. And Grief to Grace itself is actually compiled by a remarkable American woman, Dr. Teresa Burke, who is better known as the author of another program called Rachel's Vineyard for healing post-abortive trauma. She's actually working on a third program called A Duty to Heal for soldiers returning from battle zones at the moment. Because there is a commonality about trauma and the way that it works out in the human person, that once you understand those symptoms, you can begin to unpick some of that damage. And the connection between Grief to Grace and Rachel's Vineyard is more in that sense than simply that they're by the same author, because there's a kind of causal link. So Teresa's story is very interesting. As a doctoral student, she was counselling a group of women who had eating disorders. And one by one, the issue of abortion came up for them. They either revealed that they had an abortion, or they were triggered by the mention of it, and it's like, you mustn't discuss that, you can't discuss that. And Teresa began to understand that actually the eating disorder was a symptom of post-abortion trauma, and a way of the body telling the story. And once you begin to think in these terms of the body telling the story, we're on the money in terms of trauma. It's much less to do with thinking and a sort of problem of perception psychologically, and much more to do with unfinished business that the body's going to find a way of talking about. So think about a woman who fills herself as full as she possibly can and then vomits it all up to make herself empty. That's a really, really dramatic way of recreating what she's done in an abortion, where she's full and then she's empty. And that's a really horrible cycle for her. So she repeats it. So that brings us to this fundamental sort of point which connects both these programs, which is the trauma. And what was happening was that Teresa had designed Rachel's Vineyard, and women were grieving their abortion and dealing with the aftermath of their abortion. And it was a bit like the layers of an onion. Once they'd done that, a proportion of them were realising that that wasn't the fundamental trauma in their lives, that actually there was an even deeper layer of trauma, and it was sexual abuse in childhood. So to use an analogy, it's like if there's a crack at the bottom of the wall, everything that's built on top of that is stressing on that crack. So they were taking down some of the layers, and as they did so, they realised it was even deeper. So having pioneered Rachel's Vineyard, and that going pretty much worldwide, in 2006, Teresa used the same understanding of trauma to launch Grief to Grace, which is similar in its approach. Rachel's Vineyard, Grief to Grace both have this integrated use of the scriptures. Grief to Grace is a bit longer. It's a 5-day residential program, whereas Rachel's Vineyard is a weekend. And what's very interesting is that here we are, 2022. Teresa published a groundbreaking book called Forbidden Grief about post-abortion trauma. And this is right at the advent of the kind of real sort of mainstreaming of brain scans. And pretty much everything that's been published since has completely validated what Teresa observed and wrote about trauma. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's key to this understanding. One of the great leading clinicians in the world is a man called Bessel van der Kolk. And his book on this, which is actually a paperback, and actually it's quite approachable for anybody who thinks it might be relevant, has this very telling title. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. The Body Keeps the Score. Trauma is a slightly overused word. It's not traumatic if I lose my mobile phone, even though I might say, oh, it's so traumatic. Trauma is actually a threat to your bodily integrity, survival, or to the bodily integrity or survival of someone close to you. And trauma is not even the event, it's the effects of the event, it's the kind of aftermath. Now, that, because it's about survival, it's impacting a very primitive part of the human brain. If you are a hunter-gatherer on the African savannas 100,000 years ago and you're being charged at by a wild animal, you don't have time to get your slide rule out and say, well, if a woolly mammoth can run at 20 miles every 30 seconds and I can run at 30, etc. You don't have time for that. You've got to react. You've literally got a split second. And we all have that in us. I remember when I was learning to drive, my big fear was that if someone ran out in front of me, I would just freeze and drive over them. And then when it first happened, I'd put my foot on the brake and stopped before I'd even realised it had happened. Now that's taking place in a very primitive part of the brain, in the brainstem, where there's a gland called the amygdala, which is like your survival smoke detector gland. Danger, it says. And we have instinctive reactions to this threat. Fight flight is it's coming into common parlance because that's a survival mechanism. But the older one is a shutdown, is to collapse. That was the oldest survival instinct in the species, in organisms, in mammals. The human person evolved a whole bit on the front of the brain, prefrontal cortex, grey matter, and that is the thinking executive part of your brain. Guess what? In the face of danger, that all goes offline. And this is what brain scans have shown categorically. Because you don't need that bit. You simply don't need it. In fact, you haven't got time to use that bit. And that includes a part of your brain here called Broca's area, after the man who discovered it, which is the speech area of your brain. That goes offline, which has huge implications, for example, in terms of things like rape trials, where if a barrister can just trigger a witness enough, they're going to become incoherent, because in the face of recalling that danger, the prefrontal cortex is going to shut down. And we know this from everyday life. If you've just been in a car accident, it's very hard to give a coherent account of what's happened. So this brain chemistry is at the heart of understanding trauma, fundamentally at the heart of understanding how trauma is remembered and processed, and fundamental to an understanding that the survivors of sexual abuse have memories that are different. Survivors of any trauma, people who have PTSD after their abortions, it is not because they can't bear to not think about it. It's not because they keep on rubbing your face in it because they can't get over it. It's because they are living with a whole altered level of brain and body chemistry. The brain is literally rewired if this threat is so serious that all the neurobiological arousal to fight or flee or to shut down, if those aren't processed, if they're not completed, then that goes on being what dictates how the person reacts to ordinary everyday things. Now, that has lots of consequences. And the first and most important one in terms of thinking about the relationship between childhood sexual abuse, childhood trauma and abortion is what we call trauma reenactment. Now, you would think that if something terrible happens to me, I would flee it. I would do everything to escape it. That, of course, is what this whole brain-body chemistry is set up to do. But if I can't, because I'm a child being abused by someone who's much more powerful than I am, then actually it tips over into collapse. So rather than flee it as an adult, what tends to happen is people reenact it as a way of completely unconsciously telling a story which can't be told in any other way. So the compulsion to repeat trauma is quite hard to understand until you put it in the context of what happens when you lose your wallet. You look everywhere, turn the place upside down. And when you turn the place upside down, you can't find it. What do? You go back to where you first started looking and you start looking again. Why would you do that? Because you hope for a different outcome. It's as simple as that. You hope that the outcome will be different. And that's why people repeat trauma. Because they hope for a different outcome. So it sounds slightly odd until you put it in that context. Because at the heart of trauma is an experience of powerlessness. And remember that the human psyche is set up to avoid that at all costs. Its job is to keep me, as it were, in control. So if there's what we call a big T trauma, like sexual abuse, that powerlessness is triggering all those survival instincts in me. It's doing so not because of my thinking, it's doing so because of my neurobiology, which is saying you are under threat here. So you can't fight or flee because the person is bigger, more powerful, they've threatened you, or, God forbid, because you're strapped to an abortion table. So what do? There's a whole nervous system change which goes into this collapse. And in the animal kingdom, the collapse means that you play dead. So a predator might leave you. A cat generally won't eat a live mouse. So often, how many times have you seen a cat bring a mouse in? You think it's dead, but actually the minute the cat releases it, the mouse will run off because the mouse has actually done that instinctive thing of playing dead. Well, in human terms, what you're setting up is this mechanism whereby the person who has trauma is either in a state of hyper arousal, where they're angry, want to fight, want to run away, or they're shut down and they can't. Now, those two things happen at the same time in the human nervous system. So it's like having one foot on the brake of your car and the other foot on the accelerator. What you're doing is burning out the engine effectively. What that means is that it's very, very hard to have any kind of rational reaction to things. And when I say rational, I don't mean this is madness, this isn't psychosis. But it is not a thinking, rational reaction that makes me repeat trauma. It's an instinctive defense mechanism which says somehow this time around it will be different. So to talk about sexual abuse specifically, I mean, the imbalance of power makes it terrifying. The violation of your bodily integrity makes it terrifying. And so you've got a very serious trauma. Now, the psychological effects of that are going to be huge. It's going to affect your whole sense of identity. You are going to have a profound shame. Now, by shame, I don't just mean a bit of embarrassment. I mean, it's like slime that covers you. So the child of sexual abuse, for example, is not going to want to be noticed in class. Even someone looking kindly or tenderly at them may cause deep feelings of shame, because that's what an abuser probably did. So a deep shame, and shame is a spiritual reality as well, you know, it makes you hide. We know that from Genesis. It makes you hide even from the person who loves you. It diminishes your identity very seriously. You may have very little sense of your own dignity and worth. Now that is going to have a huge effect on your relationships. So, for example, a woman who is the victim of child sexual abuse very often and very easily gets into abusive relationships later on. Not once, not twice, you know, over and over again. People who come to Grief to Grace often say, "Look, what is it about me? Why is it that every person I find, you know, is an abuser?" And the answer is because you've interiorized a sense of your own worth and dignity, which isn't consistent with saying, actually, you don't treat me like that. Because the need to be attached, the need to feel some tenderness is also there, and therefore I compromise the other part. And also because abuse is secret, and so people lose their voices. I mean, sometimes they literally lose their voices. You know, often that's how you can tell there's trauma, because the person will speak in a way that they've got a very little child's voice, or they'll start telling about something, they'll start whispering. That's all part of unfinished business. They may have been told that something terrible will happen if they speak, if they tell the truth, you know. So all these things are applying, and they're all reasons why someone would go on, paradoxically, to put themselves in danger and to recreate something of this, because if you can't tell the secret, it doesn't go away. Your body finds inventive ways of telling the story. The body keeps the score. And the earlier the abuse is, the more dramatic the symptoms will be, because if you're something like 5 when you're abused sexually, and tragically it happens, it's almost pre-verbal. You don't actually have the words for it. So you're going to tell this story through self-harm, through eating disorders, and through, again, paradoxically, this wrapping yourself in trauma. So you've been sexually abused in childhood, but you go on to be very promiscuous, because you're driven by the compulsion to recreate the trauma, because your sense of what normal sexual relationships are like have been violated, because you've been overwhelmed by the erotic at a very early age. So then you've got this kind of double bind, which is you now become your own abuser effectively by repeating behaviours that bring shame, bring more anxiety and more compulsion. Van der Kolk says that's one of the deepest indicators of trauma, you know, the repetition of unhealthy behaviours. And I don't know what his sort of spiritual take is. I think he's a believer of some kind. And he certainly talks about a spiritual component to this. But he poses the question, why the repetition of trauma? And he says because trauma and abuse inflict on the human mind the reality of evil. So it's almost as if in the face of this evil, the person is scrabbling to make sense of it, scrabbling to escape it, like a moth that keeps going to a flame. So let's think specifically about sexual trauma, capital T trauma, sexual abuse. How does that relate to abortion? Very easily and very obviously. It means that a woman is easily going to be manipulated. She's easily going to be in an abusive relationship. If a significant man in her life, an uncle, God forbid, a father, a brother, if they have abused her bodily integrity, then she's easily going to be prey to abusive relationships. She is even going to find that the experience of the surgical abortion, for example, itself is a kind of recreation, because she's going to be powerless as an abortionist, usually a man, puts his hand or his instrument in the same sacred space that was violated originally. And women do report this. They report that this feeling of this sense of actually it was like a complete reenactment of abuse, which is exactly what it is. And imagine the pain that at some level you know this and yet you feel compelled to do it anyway. I think it's important at this point to talk about what that means, for example, for women who conceive a child after rape. We're in a context at the moment where Roe v. Wade is being debated, and every time you see people being interviewed, they say, but what about rape? As though somehow that would justify it, when we know it's a tiny fraction of abortions are because of rape, less than 2% at the most. A survey of 200 women reported that only 7% of them, 200 women who conceived after rape, 7% of them thought it was the right decision to abort their child. They had abortions. 93% of them said, no, that was another violation. That was a reenactment. I felt like the abortionist was like my rapist. So again, the compassion that we need to have for women who are going through abortion, because it just feels familiar. It's the old playbook. A man tells you what to do. He uses you as an object sexually. You then become an object in an abortory for somebody else who's going to take this child away from you. And part of healing from the trauma of childhood abuse of any kind is working with what we call the inner child. Well, psychology always talks about the inner child. In our context, we think of this inner child as really like the baptismal child, the person that God, your true identity that God gave you, in baptism, your innocence. But imagine if your inner child is so damaged that you can't even nurture the inner child in yourself, and you let somebody abort that. You are piling layer upon layer of trauma on what's already, terrible. So you were a victim as a child, and in the name of choice or liberation, you are piling yet more victimhood on yourself with the idea it's going to make it better. So it's a really vicious kind of cycle, and this whole repetition of trauma is so understanding that is so fundamental, because otherwise we run the risk of literally empowering people to destroy themselves. And it's kind of hard to understand, but it begins to make sense if you say, well, hang on a second, what story is the body trying to tell here? If it's trying to recreate something that can't be spoken, and why can't it be spoken? Because it's shameful. Then you have an abortion, and because you chose that, in inverted commas, we know that even women who choose an abortion regret it. Then you've got to be quiet about that too. So you have this whole cycle of grief that cannot be emptied because it can't be spoken. Because if you can't speak it, it's going to stay alive. So hence you go on and have repeat abortions. You have repeat abusive relationships. So fundamental to this understanding is link. And Teresa reckoned there was a minimum of about 25% of the people who came for Rachel's Vineyard had childhood sexual abortion. Fundamental to that understanding is the idea that I'm going to recreate the trauma in some way. I'm going to repeat it. Not because I want it, but because it's a way of trying to tell a story completely unconsciously. A story that couldn't be told because of shame, because I'd lost my voice. So sexual abuse, capital T trauma. But lots of people have what one might call small t traumas. And a small t trauma would be the fact that, for example, there were problems like alcohol at home. There was dysfunctional family circumstances in which, as a child, I wasn't able to grow healthily. Now, every family has problems. Nobody has a perfect childhood. But what you need is a childhood that's good enough. And to be good enough, it means that your emotions, for example, are held when appropriate and mirrored and digested and given back to you in a form that's possible for a child to deal with. But if nobody notices you, nobody comforts you, nobody cares about you, then actually you're going to develop really very serious problems with relating. So small T traumas, as I say, come from sort of dysfunctionality in the home, from neglect, and they're every bit as serious in terms of their effects as the big T traumas, because they can be year in, year out. They actually are your normal, even though you don't know it's not normal. So they set you up for the same kind of thing. And I think one very significant area of that now, of course, since we've had legalized abortion for years and years and years, is the fact that we've got so many people who themselves are traumatized by abortion who are trying to be parents. You've got siblings who are growing up in families where they know that siblings have been aborted. All of that is giving them a sense of what their identity and their worth is. And that's going to have an effect on them themselves when they come to the age when they might be thinking about having children. Their whole sense of what that means, their whole universe, their whole sense of identity is to some extent going to be predicated on the images of motherhood that they've had, the messages about what motherhood is like, the messages about what having the responsibility for a child is like. And if you've been told as a child that you're a bit of a nuisance and why don't you shut up, etc., 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 how do you have any insight into the beauty and the joy of motherhood? Yes, it's exhausting, it's unbelievably responsible, and yet it contains this deepest joy and this deepest fulfillment of somebody's need to love another, to give, to be a gift to another. So it's kind of, again, tragic if this trauma recreates itself. And in addition to having had a childhood that is less than secure and safe, you then compound that by going on to act that out in some way. Act out your own sense of what motherhood looks like, your own sense of what your own sexuality is for. Because I think we tend to talk about abortion as, again, it's a sort of surgical thing, without consequences. But for a woman to have an abortion, that is affecting her whole psychosexual identity. So her whole sense of what her sexuality is for, what her femininity is for, what her body is about. We know that people who have any kind of adverse childhood experience, small T trauma, big T trauma, always have a deep sense of disconnection from their bodies. And I think that you can begin to see that as a reality when you go to abortion rallies and things, and you've got people screaming things like keep your Eucharist off my uterus, keep your rosaries off my ovaries. I'm always so struck by the desperation of that the idea that something holy might touch this sacred part of me is actually something that gives me fear and horror, and that tells me that there's a very deep disconnection with their own body and a very deep rejection of the sanctity of their own body and the beauty of their own body. So I think that more and more we can't emphasize enough that this is the mere fact of choice doesn't mean it's a good choice. It certainly doesn't mean it's a healthy choice. It can be the very opposite for many women. It's almost a kind of suicide if your own childhood was so damaged and so attacked that you feel you've got to have your own child attacked in the womb. It's a kind of, that really is the body telling a story. So we need to have the deepest compassion for anyone in that situation, and we need to hold out to them this message that actually you didn't do this freely. You didn't even necessarily do this in the full sense of the word rationally, that your rational executive thinking brain was probably offline, and it was your scared survival brain that was driving this decision.